on so many issues, financial inclusion and workforce, for many years, and I know is very well known to our community. So I wanted to steal 30 minutes of her time to get her take on the pandemic and what it means for the work she's doing and her center is doing, and lots of other issues, whatever's on her mind. Thank you, Shamina, for taking some time with us.
It's great to be here and great to see you virtually, Raj, and just delighted to be with the DevX community.
Thanks.
You know, I rely on the DevX community a lot to help inform what we're doing at the center. So hopefully it'll be a little bit of an exchange, but really glad to be here.
Yeah, great. And we will be taking questions. Anybody who's tuning into this live on LinkedIn or YouTube, feel free to throw any questions in. If we'll try to weave them into the discussion or take them if they add something new to the conversation. Maybe we just start with what's on your mind, Shamina, because you, again, bring to this a lot of experience running this center. Maybe just tell us a word or two about that center, what you actually focus on every day, and then what you see the pandemic kind of doing to the issues that you work on every day.
Yeah. So look, I think what's on my mind is maybe what's on everybody's mind, which is what on earth is happening? How did this happen? And how are we going to get through it? And I think that for me, at least, coming at this from the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, fortunately or unfortunately, it's become a bit of an obsession because we are in a position to impact change. So the Center for Inclusive Growth was created as a way to connect the assets, in this case of Mastercard, so technology, funding, data, people, expertise, all in service of social impact. And so, so we sort of set up a model that connects research, programmatic action, philanthropic dollars, business capabilities to focus on inclusive growth. And so in our case, it's the equitable and sustainable delivery of solutions so that more people benefit from an economy, not less people. In that instance, was benefit from a growing economy. And in this instance, it's shifted to whatever this economy is, but more focused now on an inclusive recovery and inclusive distribution of therapeutics and vaccines and things like that. So the core fundamentals of the center remain the same in terms of aggregating assets, all in service of social impact, but the focus has shifted with COVID to a whole different set of issues. So and I've sort of been in the center of this, and I'm just, I think like a lot of people working nonstop, and I think much more intensely because of this Zoom and, and all of this other stuff. So it's just been an intense period of a lot of things. Yeah.
And for people who may not be familiar, there are a lot of corporates that do philanthropy, but the scale is pretty sizable here. There was a $500 million philanthropic commitment made that the center is spearheading. I guess it was made a couple of years ago now. So there's significant dollars plus all those other assets that you talk about. And I guess one of the issues maybe you could say a word about is financial inclusion, because in a lot of the low and middle income countries where the DevX community works, people are on mobile phones all the time. They're using mobile money more than ever before, whether through Mastercard or any of your competing platforms. And I guess the question is how I haven't used cash, for example, during this period. It's been tough to do. What have you seen around these issues of financial inclusion, given the fact that people are isolating and they have to be on their devices or, on the internet rather than being out in markets?
Yeah, I think it's the urgency of digitization. I mean, I think if anything, what we've seen with the research, with our programmatic partners, with the data is that those who have managed to evolve or adapt to a digital economy are surviving better than those who haven't. It's a really simple calculation. And so the bets that we made early on with organizations like Axion and Grameen and others, where we were helping MFIs and other frontline lenders grow as a digital platform, those are the bets that are really paying off. And so I think that for us, instead of sort of saying, look, let's take a step back now, which a lot of people I think are doing, and let's see what happens, we sort of leaned in and said, it's not up to us to see what happens. We actually have to help make what happens. And so we doubled down on our commitment to financial inclusion and actually have committed now to bring 500 million more people into the formal economy, 50 million more businesses into the formal economy. a particular emphasis on women-run and women-owned businesses, because if anything, COVID has deepened our commitment, but also accelerated the urgency.
What does that mean to try to bring more people into the formal economy, get them, onto financial platforms, to get them banked is the term of art a lot of people use.
Yeah.
What does it mean to actually do that now? Like, how are
Yeah.
you gonna accelerate that?
Well, there's a couple, one on the commitment side. So we're definitely doing the things that we have been doing in terms of partnering with organizations like CDFIs in the United States, MFIs outside of the United States, NGOs like Mercy Corps and many others, to help them do what they do best. And then working together, use our goods and services. So for example, in Africa, we started a program with Unilever focused on bringing their supply chain merchants into the formal economy by using the data, their purchase history with Unilever to qualify for creditworthiness. And so it's a little.
So you can see that they're paying their bills to Unilever, therefore they must be creditworthy and give them loans.
And so a traditional bank might look at that, might not use that as a calculation to issue credit at reasonable interest rates. And so because it's Mastercard and because it's Unilever working on this together, we've been able to bring Kenya Commercial Bank into the partnership to say, would you recognize this behavior as proxy for credit score, if you will? And because of that, would you lend at very reasonable interest rates? And what we've seen is huge uptake on those kinds of loans. So the commitment is about redoubling our efforts, but it's also the recognition that because we've been doing this for so many years, we have a lot of lessons that we've learned along the way that help us now do things differently with regard both to small business, but also to individuals. But it really does rely on, as you said, mobile phone technology, but also basic things like identification. Like we're still trying to make sure that people have the necessary credentials to access the formal economy.
Yeah, there's 1 billion people in the world without a formal ID. And I know something we've reported on at DevX is that it's tough. If you're a UN agency like UNHCR, you might be able to give out a temporary ID to people in a refugee camp. But other vulnerable groups might have a hard time getting access to the ID they need to get the mobile phone and to get the bank account. What do you do to try to mitigate that reality, given that it's for so many people are living through that?
Well, we have to evolve our notions of what ID is and what it's used for, right? And so I think the larger issue of COVID, like I said, has accelerated and it's created the urgency, but we still have to focus on the how. Like, what we're really making sure is that we keep our essential components around digital responsibility, data responsibility, in what we call at Mastercard sort of a decency quotient. So the how we do this is just as important as what we do. And when it comes to things like digital ID and things like that, we're hoping that this cannot be a rush to sort of say, okay, everybody centralize ID, let it be held in one place. And there's one entity, in some cases government, that distribute the ID. That's actually not the way that, a world with decentralized capabilities can manage ID. You don't need, you don't need to know social security number, date of birth, all those other things if you want to buy a bottle of milk. You just need to know enough to get the bottle of milk.
And your point is there's real risk in that, right? I mean, somebody could, if someone was able to hack it, or you would have too much data out there for an individual controlled and owned by one entity, even by government.
Potentially. I mean, what you don't want to do is set up a system where you have a honeypot model where everything sits in one place.
Yeah.
And one hack and it's all, and it's all a mess. And so that's why it's like, with all of this stuff, the how, I just want to, it's the how is just as important as the what. And so I hope with the urgency, people don't throw their principles and don't throw their, commitment to ethics and responsibility out the window. So,
and that can happen. I've heard that concern from a number of others, that in a moment like this, in a moment of crisis, people need to move fast, and so you move really fast, but then you create some long-term problems in the way you structure things if you don't stick to your principles around data protection and privacy. It is Yeah,
Exactly.
it's a real issue.
So,
I want to get your take on something. You talked about the stores, that could use credit based on their payments to Unilever. There's a lot of conversation in the U.S. about small retail and how
yep.
they're gonna, they're getting really hit by this. Bigger retail, bigger businesses. They've got the online tools. They know how to take payment any which way. They know how to, they have a supply chain that's digitized. They're set up for a world under lockdown, as we've been in for quite some time. And in some ways, they were already accelerating their growth. They were already beating the small mom and pop store. Now, maybe just more than ever, that will happen. What do you see in low and middle income countries? Is this like a broader based concern that if you run a small shop wherever you are in the world, that if you don't get onto the digitization bandwagon quick, if you're not able to take digital payments and deliver and have a supply chain that's digitized, et cetera, that you're going to essentially get beaten out by the biggest competitors in the world?
Well, gosh, I hope not. I mean, I think we all know that mom and pop shops, Kirana shops, they're the front lines of service to all communities. And so without them, I think we're lost. So, I mean, the way we've been thinking about this at Mastercard has sort of been in 4 different, phases of work. And so we think about Corona as, the containment phase. And so we've got a ton of work going on with the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust around creating a COVID Therapeutics Accelerator. So there's a containment phase around that. There's a stabilization phase. There's the normalization phase, and then hopefully back to growth. And so depending on where you are in the world and depending on what's happening in your particular situation, sort of puts you in a place where you're focused on a different piece of the equation. So for the emergency response right now, this idea of pulling down funds from a fiscal stimulus package makes a lot of sense. You need the emergency funding. Over time, though, we have to work towards recovery. And so that's where places like mom and pop shops and things like that, like if they can survive the initial hit and working with government stimulus packages, MFI, frontline lenders, community banks to get the money to keep them going. There's places for us to come in around the recovery portion of that helps mitigate that. If they can mitigate the damage, we can help them sort of recover faster. And that's where this digitization piece is. Access to markets. Can we bring them online more quickly? Can we help them reimagine their business in a way that provides the service, but also helps them survive? And those are the types of partnerships that we're anticipating right now that we're going to be needing over the long term. But really, it depends on where you are in the world. And, we're starting to see the virus expand in South America. We're starting to see it expand in other parts of the world, even as it does its damage through more developed markets.
Yeah, and you're not going to have, in those lower income countries, you're not going to have the same level of fiscal stimulus as you have here in the United States or in Europe. And that's where having access to finance, to be able to get credit at reasonable rates, is more important than ever.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting because even with the with our partnership with the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation around this Therapeutics Accelerator, we took a chance on that as one of the first private sector companies to join, because I think we realized early on, and what a lot of other companies are realizing now, is that we all have to move beyond our comfort zones. And so we all, those with resources and ability and capability have also the innovation mindset. And so I think when it comes to COVID, investing and partnering with organizations that are actually working on the vaccine and the therapeutic and the diagnostics, it's really important for all of us to focus on this, because if we don't get to a place down the road that has a vaccine that is distributed equitably, I think we're going to be suffering for a much longer period of time. So we jumped in.
The best thing you could probably do for small business or retail is get that effective therapeutic out there soon, so people feel more confident they can go out and then eventually get to a vaccine where we can get past this. You're absolutely right.
Exactly.
It's not just if we stay in our lane and we only do our thing, it limits our ability to actually help the people we're trying to help. Right.
You're multinational for a reason. You're a multinational corporation for a reason, because you can see what's happening in different markets and connect the dots. And your destiny as a company is tied to markets that survive. And so I think that, people ask why Mastercard got involved in a therapeutics accelerator. And I think for us, it was a pretty simple calculation that, we can't survive in a failing economy. And neither can many other companies. And so unless we're all sort of unified around finding the therapeutics, even as they find the vaccine, we're all going to be, in a whole lot more trouble for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I want to get your take on private sector overall, but real quick, just staying on low-income countries for a second. One of the differences with low-income countries is the percentage of informal workers. And so in so many of these countries, you've got very high percentages of people that need to get out of their home every single day to work in order to get paid that day, to be able to buy something in a market to eat. How do you see this pandemic in many of those markets that Mastercard works just about everywhere in the world? What do you see the dynamics being like around informal workers now and the potential to formalize these processes? What do you see happening because of the pandemic?
I think it's going to be accelerated in terms of formalizing the work. I was actually talking to one of your colleagues at DevEx, and she was describing what your journalists are seeing around the world. Like in the Philippines, for example, they have a pass, and you can go out during certain hours of the day. And so actually, I'd be interested to hear what DevEx is learning in this space, because your people are on the ground everywhere and living through this. And so I think that's why I'm here, is to really learn to understand what you're seeing so that we can make smarter, better decisions. So I'd love to actually hear what the DevEx community is seeing around this stuff.
Yeah, it's a diverse, I think our reporters are seeing a diverse landscape. Depends a lot on the country. Many countries where we were very worried that you would see a quick uptake in the virus haven't had big numbers so far. But that doesn't mean that the epidemiologists we talk to say, hey, it can still come. This in some countries where there's less travel, for example, less connectivity to the outside world, you might see a slower spread of the virus in the early going, but eventually it's likely to come there. Hard to know what the seasonality issues are. So there's a lot of concern. Mostly what we hear is concern, but in many of the countries that have gone through a period of lockdown or isolation, it's been really hard on people because of the informality in their workforce. Here in more advanced economies, you can have delivery services pretty easily. You can have access to finance and lending and all the things that you and your company work on. And that's not always the case for countries where 80% of the population are informal workers or people who live in slums, and they can't really, they can stay at home, but they're very tightly packed in, and they need to leave for basic services, and even for basic sanitation services. So, so far the world has been somewhat spared from the virus hitting the lowest income countries in the world in a really big way. But if that comes, and it may well come in places like Nigeria, you may see a really significant toll. And the big question our reporters are asking is, what is the world ready for that? We're now a few months into this. What has been done to prepare us for that moment? And obviously, if we can get therapeutics, that's really important, but can we get them out to everybody? If we can get a vaccine, it's really important, but can we get it out to everybody who needs it? And these are really big open questions right now that we're covering.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of this, right? It's sort of like, it's the urgency and it's the how. And I think you've hit on exactly the issue that I'm obsessed with, is the equitable distribution of a therapeutic or a vaccine. And so what we have seen is when there is a focus on this kind of work, the practical application of that means you have to buy manufacturing capability. You have to reserve manufacturing capability right now, so that when this thing comes, you've reserved your piece of the pie to focus on equitable distribution. Because right now, countries around the world or businesses around the world might be reserving their manufacturing capability, but it may not necessarily be for the equity and the distribution of it equitably. And so part of what we're focused on with this accelerator is reserving manufacturing capability. So the very practical things that companies and organizations have to do to deliver a vaccine or deliver a therapeutic, when you have a focus on equitable distribution or how are low to moderate income countries going to get this? You have to be much more proactive about identifying manufacturing resources, identifying sources of materials, and working with them to make sure that they're reserving for when they do find the vaccine. And that's exactly the type of thing that, because we sit as a global company and because we're committed to the inclusive growth, where we can work with an organization like Gates and Wellcome Trust and many of the other funders who are now focused on this in a real way, to take practical steps to ensure that as much as possible, we're building capacity for people to have equitable access to the vaccine and to the therapeutics.
You mentioned that some people kind of looked at this and said, why is Mastercard partnering with Gates and Wellcome on a therapeutics accelerator? What are you seeing companies in general doing? Like, what's your feeling about how the private sector is understanding the situation that the world is in, especially big multinationals, and responding to it? What are you feeling and hearing from your colleagues at other businesses?
So I think that, again, it's just like the public sector is sort of this massive thing. I think the private sector is this massive thing. And so I think for those, hopefully for those companies who can, they are doing what they need to do to contribute to sort of the public good around this. I think, folks like, I've seen Unilever, the pharma companies, do the things that I think are breaking the mold. And so I've been on calls with, companies where they say, look, if we find a treatment or a vaccine, we're going to open it up to others who, so they're having serious IP conversations around what happens. And that is,
the big question is whether their governments will allow that, right? There's a chance that even if companies want to do it, their governments will say, hang on, we're holding on to this manufacturing capability or what have you.
Well, I think you've hit on something, Raj, and that is that the partnership between the public and the private has never been more important. And I am seeing the synergy between the two and how they have to work together. And I think, because you're right, like even if a private sector company like Mastercard, who has an ability who is borderless in some respects, like the network is in 210 markets, it doesn't necessarily see borders and boundaries. If there is a particular government who nationalizes the resources or who closes down the border or whatever that is in terms of the vaccine or the treatment, it makes it hard for the
what do you do?
Or organizations who have the capability to actually execute against the capability. And so these are some pretty existential questions, I think, that are requiring a lot of different kinds of approaches.
We got a question in, and I think it's relevant to your organization that you do work with nonprofit partners, you fund them. We had a big story out yesterday, an exclusive on DevX about Oxfam, tragic news that they're laying off over 1,000 people around the world, Oxfam International. And this question is, what do you see kind of the job market like for people who work in global development, work in NGOs going forward as an organization that does fund and does partner with NGOs around the world? What are you seeing and hearing? And do you think corporates are going to step up to do more for the nonprofit community if they do kind of get hit in other areas, as many right now are?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, right? So it's time to I think organizations have to look at their funding sources, and it's sort of like the diversity of funding sources and your portfolio of partners becomes extremely important. So reliance on reliance on a single funding source or predominance of a single funding source, I think puts organizations at a lot of risk. And so that's why I do think that this is a moment for private sector organizations who have the capability to partner to step in. But Raj, I want to be really clear on this. Because I've been on both sides, so have you. The NGO community also has to open up its vantage point about how they're thinking about partnering too. And so the lack of trust on both sides of the equation, we're seeing the fallout. Who gets hurt in the end when Oxfam goes out? But when a private sector company or a small business goes out, the person at the receiving end of this. And so isn't it our responsibility to sort of see past traditional notions of what an NGO does, what a private sector company does, and work and somehow come up with a different kind of trust model so that we're actually working together to figure this out, rather than creating winners and losers in a situation like this. I mean, I'm not saying that about Oxfam in particular, but I'm saying that what I've noticed, having done public service for many, many years, and now working at the center, is that this fundamental lack of compatibility or trust, or this us versus them, frankly, between, I think NGO sector and private sector and vice versa, is it cannot continue in the same way that it has continued. So I'm really hopeful that we can figure out new models of working together.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a healthy tension between sectors, but it can become unhealthy. and I think the healthy part of it is when it's all about results and data and metrics, and you can actually point to, hey, what are we trying to achieve together? And I think there's skepticism from nonprofits about corporates, and some of it's really warranted. But then there are also corporates that do a lot of really impactful things. And often the story I tell in my book, The Business of Changing the World, about McDonald's, where the day that they announced they were going to offer apples as an option on the Happy Meal, they became the world's largest buyer of apples that day. Sometimes the scale of corporations are something that even the biggest not-for-profit organizations can't fathom. And so there are real opportunities when you can find those mission aligned and kind of metrics oriented opportunities to really work together for people in need and make a big difference in people's lives.
And I think that's probably part about using assets here. And so, just yesterday, we launched a new competition around data for social impact. And so we worked with Rockefeller Foundation to start an organization called data.org, which is really building capacity of social sector organizations to realize the power of data. So we launched a $10 million challenge yesterday for any teams, any organizations around the world to figure out or come up with solutions to scale that leverage the power of data for social impact.
Yeah, that's big news. Some of us remember, the original data.org back when Bono, before the One campaign, that was the original name. And it was exciting to see the resurrection of that name with a new mission. And we'll definitely post that here in the comments along with this video, so people are aware of it and can find out the huge opportunities there are in using data. We're starting to run a little bit out of time. We do have a couple more questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to anything else that you wanted to talk about. Somebody's asking about nonprofits and their need to, as you were talking about, to reconsider their role, think about their diversity of funding. What role do you think in general NGOs should be playing in a sustainable future? Your center is all about long-term sustainability, and that's kind of the goal of inclusivity. How do you want to see nonprofits change their roles?
Look, I'm not going to, I don't know that I can speak, on the nonprofit side. I'm just going to sit in my little, the Center for Inclusive Growth. The way that we think about it is called commercially sustainable social impact. And the idea behind it is that all sustainable solutions it cannot live on philanthropy alone. So if you really want long-term change to take effect, it has to be a combination of philanthropy, of commercial incentive, public and private coming together. So it's not that I'm saying, here's what a nonprofit should do. I think that there's a way to sort of look at this entire system and sort of say, you have to figure out what the spectrum is of profitability, sustainability, philanthropy. They're all parts of the same spectrum. But the point is, if you want lasting change for stronger communities, you have to figure out a way that we're sort of advocating, I think, that allows for commercial incentive to live alongside profitability and sustainability, because in the end, they cannot be mutually exclusive, and they're not. If you focus on the decency quotient, and that's why the how always has to be at the center of the equation.
Makes sense. So let me just ask you as we kind of wrap up here, how you see things unfolding from here. There's so much uncertainty. You started off the discussion saying that we're all trying to figure out what's going to happen. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, you got into this work, you founded the center because of the massive inequality in the world. That's, I just interviewed Winnie Byanyima on one of these conversations recently, and she was saying that inequality is, becoming more transparent now in many ways because of this crisis. You're really seeing the difference between those who have the strong health systems and those who don't, those who have a strong economy, those who don't. I don't know, how do you see all of these issues playing out? The inequality question, the inclusiveness of economic growth question in the wake of this pandemic as it goes forward?
I mean, I think Winnie's right. We see, I mean, the transparency, it's here, it's happening. It's always been here and it's always been happening. And so I think we're sort of focused on the urgency of now and sort of working to do whatever we can do with all the partners we can work with all the organizations we can work with to accelerate what we have known has been coming for a long time, which is the march of technology, the march of digitization, the need to adapt, the need to innovate, the need for us to become lifelong learners. And, it's sort of like, so I'm not, the new world order. I don't know. I mean, that's not my place to talk about. I'm pretty much, Raj, as you know, I'm really a practical pragmatist. Like I'm not.
I would still love to hear what you think about the new world order.
The new world order. Like my job here is to make sure that every day in every way where we're all sitting, we're maximizing our assets to make sure they're focused on the solution. And so I will let others prognosticate about the problems and everything else. I have got to be every day focused on how we're fixing this and what the solution is. And so I welcome others to give us advice on what we can do, what we should do. Right now, we're working shoulder to shoulder with anybody who wants to help us get out of this.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people watching this are going to be eager to find ways to work together with you. We will be covering and following the Therapeutics Accelerator, your work at data.org, and so much else. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thanks for taking a little time. It's really nice to see you.
Great to see you, Raj. Breast to Maria Teresa.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.